Well, welcome to the latest webinar from the Open Group. Today's event is being brought to us by Architecting the Enterprise, which is an extremely active member of the Open Group. Speaker today is Sandy Britton. Over to Sandy. I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping issues to keep the event moving forward smoothly. With regards to questions, we would encourage you to submit questions. This is a very important aspect of bringing these events to you. The best way to write a question is to actually write it into the QA text facility. If you do put a question there, can I ask you to address your question to all participants, and that one gets a visibility of all the questions that are being submitted. We intend to try and answer as many questions as we possibly can at the end of the event. So please do write your questions into the QA facility. This presentation is also being fully recorded, so if for any reason you have to leave early, or if you experience any local technical difficulties, then a full recording of this event will be available from tomorrow. And everyone that's registered for the event will get an email which will have the appropriate URL where you can actually access that recording. That email will also include a URL where you'll be able to download a copy of Sandy's slides. So if you look out for that email, you can get a URL when you get the recording, and also get a copy of Sandy's slides via download. So Sandy, if you're ready, I'll ask you to start your presentation.
Thanks very much, Simon, and well, welcome everybody. Good evening, afternoon or morning, depending on where you happen to be. I'm in New Zealand, so it's evening for me, but I'm well aware that we've got people logged in from various different parts of the world. So let me just first of all start this presentation this evening with just a word about Architecting the Enterprise and the Open Group. So as a company, I provide professional services, certified TOGAF training and ArchiMate training. We've been involved in the sponsorship of ArchiMate by the Open Group from the outset, and several key members of staff in our group are involved in the ArchiMate forum and its working groups. And one of the key ones of these is the TOGAF ArchiMate harmonization project. I'll say a bit more about that at the end. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, very common questions we're getting at the moment from lots of people is, how does ArchiMate relate to TOGAF? The short answer to this is that TOGAF is an old framework for planning and undertaking enterprise architecture work. And part of this work is to be able to describe enterprise architectures as evolve over time. And exactly what ArchiMate is designed for: structured language or notation for describing enterprise architectures. So ArchiMate has a great deal of potential value in this space, in combination with an overall approach based on TOGAF. So the aim of this webinar is to give people some insight into the two specifications and to show ArchiMate complements the use of TOGAF. We're also seeking to highlight practical ways you can make ArchiMate work for you if you're already using TOGAF. With that in mind, the webinar is structured as follows. First of all, we'll have a quick chat about the role of modelling in enterprise architecture in general, and then go on to describe some of the key features, the scope and purpose of both TOGAF and ArchiMate, and in that way we can see how the two specifications relate to each other. And obviously the key area of overlap here is the way in which both TOGAF and ArchiMate handle the generation and management of enterprise architecture content. And we'll go on to look at how ArchiMate can be used to add value to EA development and use some examples to illustrate the key concepts. So and then finally we'll wrap up with talking about modelling tools a little bit and the future convergence of TOGAF and ArchiMate before we go on to the Q&A. One thing to say is that I've got a lot of slides here. I've actually probably got more we can go through so in the time available. So I will skip some of the slides towards the end, mostly to make sure that we do have time for questions. Okay, another very quick thing is that I do need to say that the materials that we do have here are reproduced under commercial license, and materials that come from both TOGAF 9 and from ArchiMate reproduced under commercial license. So that's just what I need to say there. Okay, let's dive in. Enterprise. The definition at the top of this slide is the ArchiMate definition of an enterprise. And a typical enterprise is a large, senior organisation with many parts, and therefore can be treated as a complex system. The goal of enterprise architecture modelling in general is to be able to produce consistent, coherent descriptions of the organisation. But this is a difficult problem because you have to cover all of the business structures and functions, the information and technology elements, and the infrastructure as well. We're talking about spanning multiple systems and multiple functional groups within the enterprise. The enterprise architecture models or descriptions that we develop are for stakeholders, and stakeholders are different. They have different perspectives and some multiple levels of detail required and different views for different purposes. So the challenge there is to be able to manage the complexity of information and maintain a coherent view of the big picture of the architecture for an entire enterprise, and that's a challenge. Another typical challenge for enterprise architects is able to maintain traceability, so that you can look at the impact of a change in one element in the architecture and how that will impact on other, perhaps distal elements in the architecture. These are big challenges. So how do we tackle this? Well, let's just first go back and establish the overall aims and approach of enterprise architecture in general, and this slide helps to do that. In enterprise architecture is to be able to support organisation strategy and change initiatives by a detailed, grounded and accurate description of the organisation's business structures, their functions, data, IT application, IT systems, technologies and so on, in terms of the components and the relationships between components. And crucially, at different points in time, usually expressed as a kind of current state picture and some future state picture. And that provides a roadmap on which we can share work packages in order to implement the changes that we've identified. But this, we need to be able to create rules at multiple levels of breadth, depth and abstraction in any typical large enterprise situation. Consistency in our descriptions in order to ensure completeness and achieve things like traceability and coherence and so on. We also need stakeholders to be able to read and comprehend these descriptions to ensure their accuracy. So what we're doing here is the idea of an architecture description being composed of this architecture descriptions of the information systems and the technology. So whether that's IT architecture and business architecture, both as in a current state situation and some kind of target or to be situation. And the key here is to understand how aspects of the IT architecture will align with this architecture in this target state. We need to be able to trace the impact of changing any element of business or IT architecture on other components that are related to it in some way. So this is the requirement of traceability. And nowhere is this more important than being able to transfer the target architecture back to the requirements, concerns, goals and stakeholders that motivated the proposed changes in the first place. If we can go further than that and say that we have to be able to trace the roadmap elements, i.e. the content of work packages, back through the architecture to the motivations that raised them in the first place. So I've compiled a list of issues of concern for enterprise architects in terms of modelling. So achieving consistency, and I've described that, achieving completeness, traceability, the accuracy of representations of the enterprise architecture, the readability of them as well. So both by human and machine. Increasingly, we need to use tools to support our work in terms of doing impact analysis on enterprise architecture descriptions, and so we need the architecture descriptions to be interpretable by a machine, and to be able to identify opportunities for reuse, both of architectures and of the descriptions and the components that they're describing. So those are issues of concern for enterprise architecture modeling in general. So to approach this problem, both TOGAF and ArchiMate provide us with tools to help us approach some of these challenges. And so let's take a look at what the specifications themselves have to say about this. So TOGAF, I'm going to assume some knowledge of TOGAF in the audience, but I'm going to describe the key points as they relate to this subject here. So TOGAF framework represents a major body of knowledge about enterprise architecture. It covers the entire enterprise architecture life cycle, from planning through development, implementation and migration. Covers governance and change management and so on. So this is an overall framework for undertaking and managing an enterprise architecture. And it's isolated in the TOGAF architecture development method, the ADM, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. And just to go through, the kind of content that we're interested in, and go through the ADM, is go through work of an enterprise architect, is first of all being able to list the business goals and drivers, to stakeholders' concerns, and principles, requirements, and so on. So we need to be able to map those out in some way. Then, we have enterprise architecture development stages. This is when most of the content gets generated. And then identify opportunities for reuse and look at how that content maps to solutions, and the roadmap components in phase E and phase F, and then the architecture's the implementation's governed through phases G, H. So TOGAF, in a nutshell, is a framework for managing and undertaking enterprise architecture work. ArchiMate is quite different. It's a standard modeling language for producing enterprise architecture descriptions. So it's independent. It's supported by different tools vendors. It's a notation for enterprise architects to describe and analyze and visualize the relationships between architecture domains in an unambiguous way. And so it gives us a common language for describing architectures, and most importantly, it's a visual design language. So it's graphically based. It's based on UML in large parts, but not completely. So the ArchiMate then is to provide a core language for representation of enterprise architectures over time. Okay, from their motivation and rationale, and the generation of requirements from goals and drivers and so on at the beginning, through the transformation and migration planning. Language provides a uniform representation for diagrams that represent enterprise architectures. So it fits in with TOGAF. It's a kind of subset of the activities of TOGAF, but it's about creating the content, okay, and the content. And here we can see how ArchiMate supports the phases of TOGAF. So there's coverage in ArchiMate 2 of the enterprise architecture development, motivation, modeling of requirements and goals and drivers and stakeholders and their concerns and so on. And through phases E, F, and G, the modeling of work packages and tradition architectures known as plateaus in ArchiMate, and so on. So this links this of the entire enterprise architecture life cycle. Okay. Let's now move forward and look at the main area of overlap between TOGAF and ArchiMate, which is in the frameworks that both of them have for describing architecture entities and architecture content. And there are three main areas here. One of them is the meta model, which is about entities and their relationships. Another area is the content framework or language structure. It doesn't have a language structure, but ArchiMate does. And the third area is in the viewpoints. Okay, TOGAF defines a set of artifacts as viewpoints, and ArchiMate also has a set of viewpoints. And there's considerable overlap between the two, but they're not entirely the same because they work independently. And so what we're here is the extent of the overlap and how we can make them work together. Okay. First of all, TOGAF defines 4 domains of architecture, as here: business architecture, applications, data, and technology. As we shall see, has 3 layers: business, application, and technology. And these broadly correspond to these domains, except that in ArchiMate, information or data descriptions are distributed across 3 layers. So there isn't a kind of separate data architecture as such. Okay. Now, here's the TOGAF meta model. I'm hoping that most of you will be broadly familiar with this, but if you're not, it doesn't matter. We won't have time, in fact, to go into this in detail right now, and it wouldn't help us much to do so anyway. But what you can see here is the 4 domains, the big yellow box at the top, business architecture, and then on the bottom layer have, on the left-hand side, data architecture, then applications and technology architecture. Okay. And so it's the domains described in the previous slide, and it itemizes within each domain the types of components that an architecture description will drive, and the ultimate relationships between component types. Okay, and we're using this for comparison with how ArchiMate describes the content. The second thing I want to say about TOGAF here is that the elements of the meta model, which can be thought of as building blocks, are described through the use of artifacts, which mount to viewpoints in TOGAF. There are 3 main types of artifacts in TOGAF. That is, catalogs, matrices, and diagrams. Okay, some examples of those here. Note that ArchiMate, being a graphical notation, only uses diagrams. Now, a matrix can, in theory, be represented as a diagram, and so any of the catalogs or the matrices or the diagrams in TOGAF could be represented in ArchiMate. That's fine. In case that you would necessarily want to represent, say, matrices as diagrams. For example, imagine you had a large, very sparse matrix with lots of entities and very few connections. That would be better represented as a diagram, where a compact, densely populated matrix with lots of connections would very likely make an awful diagram with lines crisscrossing everywhere and being very hard to read. So, there are times when matrices and catalogs are useful representations of information, even by using ArchiMate. The TOGAF is clearly the TOGAF diagrams which can be substituted with ArchiMate diagrams, and in TOGAF there's no standard notation recommended, and there are very good reasons to use the standard notation in order to improve the consistency, readability, and so forth, the things that I was talking about earlier. And so ArchiMate can be very well used to subserve for the TOGAF diagrams. Now, both TOGAF and ArchiMate describe a set of viewpoints. This maps out the entire set of viewpoints, catalogs, matrices, and diagrams that TOGAF recommends that you can draw. And ArchiMate provides approximate equivalents for lots of these, but it also provides many more of its own. And in fact, the viewpoints arguably provide a better overall structure and rationale behind the use of which viewpoint to develop, and we'll have a look at that in just a moment. Okay, so here's just a list of some comments on the TOGAF meta model and content framework. It's notation agnostic, so TOGAF doesn't care what notation you use. You can use UML, you can use BPN, you can use ArchiMate, you can use a diagramming technique of your own creation and your own choice. And that's flexible, that's good, but there are potential problems there with consistency, reliability, accuracy, reuse, because if you can imagine different architects using lots of different notation conventions that they've created themselves, then that makes those things harder. Another thing in the TOGAF meta model is that the relationship types are somewhat, there are quite a lot of them. They're hard to reuse in a consistent and accurate way as well. The top views are handled mainly by matrices, and there's a lack of, I would say, there's a lack of views crossing multiple domains, allowing you to, for example, align business elements with elements of the application and technology layers in a graphical way. So some of the diagrams support that, but I think it could be handled better, and ArchiMate certainly is touts that as one of its main rationales for the way it's structured. So there's no explicit modelling of the relationships between principles, requirements, stakeholders, and goals and drivers, and things like that, in relation to architecture components in the TOGAF meta model. And the innovation extension of ArchiMate supports this very well indeed. Also, there's no explicit modeling of work packages and their mapping to architecture components and then to the motivation elements. And again, this is an in ArchiMate which is incredibly useful. Okay, so with that, let's move on to have a quick look at the way that the ArchiMate language is structured. ArchiMate sees all the architecture concepts as being derivations of the most basic concepts of entity and relation. The set of enterprise architecture concepts can be further specialized into domain or company specific concepts at the bottom layer of this pyramid here. And this approach to abstraction helps us achieve an overall coherence between models at different levels of specificity. And those of you familiar with TOGAF will notice that there's some similarity with the approach embedded in the architecture continuum for encouraging reuse and consistency and so on, in terms of the specific and more generic abstractions of descriptions of architectures. And so there is some level of overlap there, although we've got room to fully explore that in this webinar. Let's turn to the areas that I believe that ArchiMate provides a very powerful advantage over the way content is treated in TOGAF. That lies in the distinction of structural and behavioral elements in ArchiMate, and the first distinction of structural elements into active and passive types. And this basic schema is to use natural language to model all sorts of typical enterprise situations. And describe the basic verification process in a customer, a bank's customer, interacting with an ATM machine, and with customer enters PIN number. So customer, which is an active structure element, modeled as an actor or a role, which describes the behavior, and information or data entity, PIN number, which is a passive structure object. That means it doesn't perform behavior, it gets manipulated by behavior. So, for example, change PIN, request new PIN, or enter PIN, and so on. So it provides a new way. If you're familiar with the TOGAF way of describing viewpoints, this provides a new way of looking at defined viewpoints. Because questions like, are we mainly interested in looking at the structural aspect of an enterprise in a given view, or the behavioral aspects? And so, and are we looking at the coherence between actor elements and behavior elements at different levels, and so on? So it's a way to describe the type of viewpoint that we're looking for, and more at viewpoints in a very short while. Okay. So we can see the generic ArchiMate meta model, and shows the structure element on the right, the element, and the passive structure element on the left. It shows another basic distinction in ArchiMate, and that's internal and external elements. So external elements interface with the environment, subsystem. And the external behavior element is a service, and the external structure element is an interface. And this provides a very natural way of modeling service orientation at all levels, the application and infrastructure. And one of the things I've always thought is missing from the TOGAF meta model is the interface element, and it forms a core part of architecture descriptions in ArchiMate in order to describe how one component interfaces with others. And a third distinction that ArchiMate makes, which doesn't have any counterpart in the TOGAF meta model, is the collective behavior, for which the responsibility is somewhat indeterminate. And this type of interaction is very, very common in organizations where the behavior results from a combination of roles or actors in a somewhat loose way. And the same thing can occur at the application level. You can describe at a certain level of abstraction behavior as resulting from a collation rather than detailing all the specific service exchanges that take place. And so this also is a useful addition to the way that TOGAF treats architecture descriptions. So the ArchiMate entities can be assigned to cells in this 3x3 matrix. So it's either a passive structure element, it's a behavior element, or it's an active structure element in either the business, application, or technology layer. Okay. Going to TOGAF, we can see that the core, what's referred to as the core structure of ArchiMate, maps onto phases B, C, and D of the of TOGAF of the ADM. So phase B, business architecture, maps to the elements of the business layer. Phase C, information systems architecture, maps to the application layer, and so on. And then the remainder of phases E, F, and G are covered by the implementation, migration, extension. Motivation extension covers the other elements of the ADM. Okay. Let's now have a look at the core concepts in ArchiMate. This is the business layer meta model. It's just the relationships. I won't go into this in detail. I'll move right ahead and just look at the actual elements themselves. And we can see here is that, well, if you're familiar with the TOGAF meta model, business actor, business role, and location all have counterparts in the TOGAF meta model, but business collection, as I've already said, and business interface don't. Okay, so additional. The behavioural elements of the business layer, except for business objects, that is. So we've got in the behavioural elements we've got business process and business function. So they're in the TOGAF meta model, but as is business event, business interaction isn't. So the passive business object, which is an information element, that doesn't have any counterpart in the business meta model. Okay, and so it allows us to model information used by the business, which then become realized as data in an information system. But we can derive more complete business models because we can describe information without having to go to the level of describing data. So I believe this is an improvement of the way this is treated in TOGAF. And here we can see business service, which is at the core of both TOGAF and ArchiMate meta models, and some other passive informational concepts which are used in ArchiMate to model the qualities of business objects, products, and services. Okay. So, can do this. In the application layer meta model, we can see that this is very constrained, and it maps us directly onto the generic meta model. So the core active structural component here is application component. Notice that in ArchiMate, it doesn't make any distinction between logical and physical. I might argue this is something of a drawback, or this is an area where TOGAF is actually more precise, because it because you have physical application component and then physical application component. ArchiMate doesn't have that, so that's just a point to note there. And then looking at the technology layer meta model, what you can see here is that there are several active elements here. So we've got node, which is the prime, but then we also have device and system software, network and communication path. And, this is interesting because there are several physical elements here. So, for example, the network describes the communication between two or more devices, as you'd expect, but communication path describes a logical link between nodes. Is a kind of logical technology component type description, which can be made more concrete by use of device and system software. So it's a somewhat different approach taken here than in the TOGAF meta model. Okay, moving components then. Let's have a quick look at the relationships, because it's in the relationships that a lot of the power of ArchiMate comes. And you can see here is that there's these are the structural relationships, but relationships in ArchiMate are much more constrained than they are in the TOGAF meta model. They have a functional semantics, which means that they encapsulate rules for structuring the models in a very grounded way. Okay, so that's about when you would use a sign. For example, a sign is typically used to connect a behavioural element to an active structural element that performs it. Okay, relation is used to indicate that an element provides a more concrete realization of a logical entity. So typically, services are realized by functions internal to the system. And similarly, use, used by is where one component uses a service or somebody provided by another component. So they encapsulate a set of business rules for structuring models. And so these are the structural relationships showing how elements are connected to each other. There are also dynamic relationships, flow and triggering, which are used to connect business processes, for example, or so you would describe a flow between process steps. A couple of other relationships as well. So there's grouping, which doesn't really have any formal semantics. And then specialization allows you to create more specialized objects from the more generic ones, and it enables you to extend the language. So the relationships are very powerful in ArchiMate. Okay, I'm just going to say very quickly that the way these relationship types are exploited provide a way of aligning business elements to application and technology layer elements through the of particularly use, assign, realize, and aggregate. And you can see that these relationships are used across layers. And they can also be used, just moving, to indicate where a remote entity, so an entity of the business layer, is connected to an entity like an application component in the application or technology layer. And so this ability to derive relationships between different elements means that it supports a much more coherent approach to impact analysis on architecture models than we would see in TOGAF. So the relationships and the description of the components in a standardized way is a powerful feature of ArchiMate. I'm going to go on finally to have a look at viewpoints. I'm aware of the time. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I just want to quickly go through some of these viewpoints. because TOGAF provides a set of viewpoints. I had a look at those at the beginning, and ArchiMate provides a set of viewpoints. So, but what ArchiMate provides and TOGAF doesn't is a structure or framework for deciding on what viewpoint you want to use, and it has two dimensions to it. It has the details, what it calls the abstraction level. Do you want to look at a very detailed part of the architecture? Do you want to look at the coherence? So do you want to look at the alignment between business, application, technology? So do you want a coherence type view, or do you want an overview type picture? Do you want to take a kind of 30,000 feet view of the architecture and look at a few things? Look at lots of things, but a relatively low level of resolution. So that's details, coherence, and overview, and then the other one is the purpose. Or views of the architecture have different purposes. Sometimes they're used for designing elements of the architecture or solutions. Some are used for making decisions, particularly by managers and so on. And sometimes they're used for just informing people. It depends on the way that you're interacting with those particular stakeholders. And so it provides this framework used to classify the viewpoints into different categories. So, for example, viewpoint, it's the organization viewpoint, and it shows the structural organizational elements. So it's mainly concerned with the structure aspect. It's concerned with coherence, and the purpose can be used for designing, deciding, or informing. Okay, so take a look at the elements involved. So here we've got businesses, location, role, business collaboration, and business interface. Organization units will be modelled as actors, typically in this kind of model. Now, we can represent an organization decomposition in TOGAF using any kind of hierarchical or nested box diagram. In ArchiMate, this is a nested box type approach to representing an organization viewpoint, but we know what type of elements these are. These are actor elements which work for organization units. So when we put this viewpoint, when we put this view into a tool, then we record effectively these as organization units with our architecture, and they can be reused in any view that we then develop, and then the analyses that we do. A different type of viewpoint in ArchiMate is shown here. This is an actor cooperation viewpoint. This is a detail level, and it's designed to show the relationships of actors with the elements of the environment. So this is a business. Again, the focus is on the business layer and its relationship between actors and organization units, and information flows between them. So here's an example of that. Okay, it's the sort of thing that would be covered by a business interaction matrix in TOGAF, showing how businesses interact with each other. So this is the representation in ArchiMate, and this is the representation in a matrix form. We also have behavior, so viewpoints that focus particularly on behavior. And so here's an application behavior example shown here. So this is application functions internal to an application component. Okay. Some very good questions coming through here, by the way. So I shall move swiftly on, and then we can hopefully deal with some of these questions. So all I point out here is that there are various different viewpoints that ArchiMate defines. Many of these are pretty well aligned already with the viewpoints. Also add extra dimensions, and new viewpoints can easily be developed, which supports the TOGAF viewpoints which aren't covered by default in the ArchiMate set. The interesting viewpoints that ArchiMate does provide is as an overview viewpoint. I talked about the overview viewpoints, is the layered one, and the goal of the layered viewpoint is to show several different layers in one diagram. So here's an example. The grouping notation is used to visually support the differentiation between the different layers, and then see going through the business layers through to application and then technology at the bottom. Okay. So some example viewpoints. So they're also those were all within the core architecture framework for ArchiMate. We all have a number of viewpoints related to the motivation, so mapping goals, drivers, and assessments of those to stakeholders, and so mapping goals to each other. Now this is the migration viewpoint, and this is the implementation of migration extension in ArchiMate, and it shows baseline description, transition description, and target architecture description as plateaus, and then gaps are defined between the plateaus, and the gap encapsulates the set of core architecture components that will change between or in that plateau, so between baseline and the transition architecture, and the gap is associated with all of those components that form part of the roadmap. Some of the questions we had here was how does ArchiMate show the difference between baseline and target architectures using the viewpoints provided in the migration extension. And here's another one in the implementation of migration. I mentioned the implementation migration viewpoint, which was a work package, as we can see here, deliverables, two elements of the architecture here, also mapped to plateau and the gaps as I described, but also mapping it back to the requirements and goals that motivated those elements in the first place. So again, this is a powerful traceability viewpoint within ArchiMate, and I do a very small example here showing what would change in such a situation. Okay, so it's nearly 1:45. Let me just wrap up. What I hope that I've shown you through the course of this presentation, and I know I've tried to cover a lot of content in a relatively short space of time, it showed the benefits of ArchiMate in combination with TOGAF in that it provides a standard notation, and that's probably the most important point. It provides a standard notation specifically developed for enterprise architecture modeling, instead of trying to co-opt other notation. That means that it doesn't work well also with BPMN, UML for more detailed process modeling, and so ArchiMate, I mean, it's still relatively young in terms of I suppose to make all of these notations work with each other. But there's absolutely no reason why a business process model in ArchiMate could not be then expanded as a BPMN diagram for a more detailed view. It TOGAF as well in the fact that it differentiates between structural, behavioural, and informational or passive structure concepts, and I think this is powerful, and it can easily be applied in TOGAF. Supports the work of the architect very, very well indeed. It provides constrained and meaningful relationships. It differentiates very well between external and internal concepts, so allows more detailed, well, perhaps it'd be better to say more coherent modelling of the relationship between services and interfaces. TOGAF meta model is service oriented, so it centres on business service and information system service, but I think ArchiMate expands that, the capabilities of that. Allows modelling of collaborations and interactions, which are real features of the way that enterprises work and should be reflected in models, and I think that's an advantage. It also supports specialization, attribute definition, and derived relationships. There are mechanisms in here for extension of the language, which I think is cool, and concepts, as we've seen, for modeling both the motivational and the implementation migration aspects of enterprise architectures. And generally, the viewpoint library supports most of the TOGAF artifacts and adds more. So ArchiMate does complement TOGAF very well indeed. And I think when you use ArchiMate with TOGAF, then you can enhance completeness, consistency, traceability, readability, accuracy, and reuse. So I think it addresses all of those points of concern I picked up on right at the beginning of the webinar. So that completes my content pretty much. Let me just say, I haven't said anything about tools. There's a tool certification program that the Open Group run, and there are a number of tools already certified. So I encourage you to go and have a look at the tools that are ArchiMate certified, and it'd be interesting to also cross-reference those with those that are TOGAF certified as well, to get insight into how well they work together. And I'd like to hand over now to Simon to run the Q&A session. So Simon, that's the webinar.
That's fantastic. Many thanks for that, Sandy. Very interesting. We've had some very interesting debates going on in the chat, and we do have a few questions that we can run through on the QA. Just before I do that, Sandy, just to remind everyone, everyone who's registered for this event will get a follow-up email, and in that email there'll be two URLs. One where you can access the event recording, the other way you can access a download of Sandy's materials. So look out for that email. If for any reason you don't see that, feel free to contact me directly, and I'll point you in the appropriate directions. So to go on with the questions then, Sandy, you've got a first question here from Gavin, and he's saying, what are the major challenges from TOGAF and ArchiMate having different meta models?
Yeah, I mean, that is something of a challenge if you try to map them to each other. This is a piece of work that obviously the TOGAF and ArchiMate harmonization project within the ArchiMate forum of the Open Group is particularly concerned with. One way, I suppose, to sidestep the issue, and I have done this myself in practice, is to use the ArchiMate meta model and the ArchiMate viewpoints mainly, and use that in combination with the TOGAF ADM. So as part of tailoring TOGAF is to actually opt to use the ArchiMate approach for the content. So if you were at the start of a new project, then that's something that you could do. Of course, if you're in the middle of a piece of work and you already have quite a lot of architecture content that is organized according to the TOGAF meta model, then it's a slightly more tricky problem. Some elements do overlap, and so you can see where those are, and many of the core TOGAF meta model elements are supported by the ArchiMate one. So you could do your own, mapping, but there will be more advice on this coming out from the TOGAF and ArchiMate harmonization project in due course. But I know that's an issue that they're tackling up front. So yeah, thanks, Gavin.
Okay, thank you for that. Question here from Ether. This is a really long one, but I'm going to read it out. I'll read it again if it helps, Sandy. He says, when I was getting TOGAF certified, in my mind, the difference between TOGAF and ArchiMate was akin to RUP and UML. Within the latter two, one element I used extensively is OCL. Does ArchiMate have an equivalent to OCL for constraints?
I'm going to say no, but I think that's one to address a bit more. That would need an extended conversation to handle that. So I'm going to say no to that immediately. But yeah,
okay.
I think that's the subject of a more extended conversation.
Don't hesitate to get in touch with me or directly with Sammy.
Yeah.
I'm sure we can.
I think he's absolutely right to say that the similarity between TOGAF and ArchiMate is roughly equivalent to RP and UML. I think that's a reasonable comparison.
Okay, thanks. Question from Raghu asking, does ArchiMate support traceability within architectures, and in brackets business to data to technology, etc.?
Yes, and ArchiMate is particularly designed to try and help you to do that by means of organising the domains conceptually as layers, a business layer sitting on top, a layer sitting underneath it, and then the technology layer sitting underneath that, and then using the cross-layer relationships to effectively connect elements in one layer to elements in another layer, putting it very, very simply, in terms of where the elements in a layer, so whether essentially an information system or technology element is responsible for handling the business operation or the business or substitute for the business structure at an information system or technology level, and the way in which, for example, business objects or business information gets realized as data, which gets realized as physical kind of data artifacts at the technology level. So it has this kind of connection as realization, and so has a connection using the use relation, the relationship type, which is how elements in lower layers, or rather elements in the upper layers, so elements of the business layer, use information systems, and how in the application layer, and how applications use technology components to support their work. So these two relationship types, realize and use, give a lot of power in aligning your models. So,
Sandy, question here from Gavin. What is the exact counterpart of actor in TOGAF? Does it apply to more than one entity?
Okay. There's an assumption in ArchiMate that you can decompose any of the elements. So this meta model has an actor model entity, and but it has an organization unit one. Now, in ArchiMate, you'll note that it doesn't have an organization unit one, but it does have an actor. But in ArchiMate, you can decompose an organization unit into sub-organizational units, and then eventually down to individuals if you see fit to as individual actors. So the main difference there is there's no organization unit type of meta model entity in ArchiMate, whereas in TOGAF.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure it does. Question here from Doug, asking how well are ArchiMate models accepted by business users? We have different people who have different views on how well the business accepts the use of ArchiMate. That typically seems to like PowerPoint presentations. He says more approachable for them. What's your experience in that area, Sandy?
Okay, I've found that ArchiMate actually works well in this area because it's so UML. It's very precise. It's great, but it's something that doesn't really go down well with business users, and senior management. It looks too technical, it looks too dry, it looks too complicated, and so on. ArchiMate has a bit of simplicity to it, which, whilst it retains a lot of the power of UML, particularly in terms of its stylization and the formal semantics that it has, but it has a lot of look to it, and because it's aimed at a higher level in general, then you can deny UML or BPMN actually. Then you can create points that have a lot of simplicity to them, which I found appealing to business users. And another thing on that note as well is that I've used it in a non-English language speaking, as a native language context. I've used it overseas, and it's worked very well for multilingual communication because it's rather simplified graphic notation. It allows stakeholders from the business to very easily identify and verify that tools that have been produced are accurate. So it doesn't take very much. I mean, any interpretation of a diagrammatic or graphic notation requires a little bit of education in order for someone completely new to it to be able to verify its accuracy. But I found that easier with ArchiMate than with other languages or notations. So I think it does work well. The other thing there is that one suggestion that I have seen in Mark Lankhorst's book, Enterprise Architect at Work, is that you could actually create a set of clip art, so very friendly notation, cartoon-like notation that the business prefers, and look at associate those to the ArchiMate notation. So, for example, the notation for actor is stickman. Well, if you wanted, a guy sitting at a computer or a lady holding some files or something instead, they could actually associate those as kind of types of actor, and so your model would retain the formal semantics whilst having a very, very friendly indeed notation. And I haven't done that myself, but it's an interesting idea.
All right, so a question kind of running on from that. It's from Robin. He says, I'm interested in mapping capabilities from a business capability model to SOA services. Is this easier with ArchiMate than TOGAF? Sorry,
can you ask the question again?
Sorry, Sandy. So he's asking, I'm interested in mapping capabilities from a business capability model to an SOA services. Is this easier with ArchiMate or with TOGAF?
That's a kind of complicated question to answer, actually. It's one of those ones. It depends on what you're trying to do and in what situation. You can definitely do it with both meta models, employee services, concepts, but whether it's easier or not, that's a hard thing to say without knowing the context. I have to say you could do it either. And one thing that I will say is that there's been an awful lot of work in the TOGAF SOA working group, which supports service-oriented and provides extra specialized concepts for modeling services. So I don't know if he's aware of that work, but I suspect he probably is. And that supports SOA modeling substantially. So it'd be very hard to say, actually, without knowing more.
All right, fine. Well, we're coming to this. So just one final question, I think. And this is from Kenneth. He's asking, can ArchiMate model virtualization?
Yes. It can. But following on from that, I'd say people asked about patterns for using ArchiMate, and I would advise people to have a look at. There's a book by called Gordon Vierde, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. directly called Mastering ArchiMate, and he provides several patterns for ArchiMate. And so if you do search on that, then I do recommend having a look at that. So this literature is starting to appear of patterns and how do you model a service bus, and how do you model virtualization and so on with ArchiMate. So growing community, and I encourage people to get involved. So.
All right, Andy, well, we've come to the end of the hour. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for your time. I think that's been a very constructive and engaging session. I'd also like to thank everyone who's participated today. And please do keep an eye on the Open Group website, because we do have webinars coming up on a regular basis. We do have another one coming up towards the end of this week. So we'd always like to see you joining on those. So once again, Sandy, thank you very much. And do you have any final words you'd like to close up with?
Thanks very much for the engagement and the participation and the questions. And just to wrap up, I'd like to just point to that last slide and say that you can download the presentation from the website. And if you have any questions, please feel free to fire them through to our website, and then they an email address on there, and they will get through to me. So.
Andy, many thanks. I'll end this session now. Thank you.
Okay, cheers, Simon.